Hi there, and welcome to my first video, which is on Burton's Batman versus Nolan's Batman. I'm sure this is going to be controversial. I know there are a lot of fans out there on both sides of the equation, but just wanted to get my thoughts out there on this video to see what you will think. I want to start though by saying I do really like the Nolan films. I think they're extremely well made, they're extremely well acted. If they're on at any time, I will always watch them. I think the production values, the camera work are all incredible. I think though, what starts it off for me with my preference is David Goyer. And if you don't know who he is, look him up. He's the guy that did Blade, and he was involved in helping Nolan put a realistic version of Batman on the screen. And he's been involved also in the DC universe, so he helped a bit with the Superman films too. Now, I know that David Goyer is a fan. I think that's well documented of the comic books, as am I. Grew up reading them in the 80s and 90s. But I think Goyer's realistic take, or the way he approached the character, I mean, he got some elements right, but to me, he didn't really appreciate some of the more essential driving characteristics that I wanted to see, and I think Burton does quite well. I know a lot of you are thinking that I'm going to go on about the voice, but that's probably going to be towards the end of the points that I want to make. And there's a whole host of other reasons why I prefer Burton over Nolan. But firstly, I think I want to say that the first scene in 89, where we see the family walking out of the theatre, Burton gives us a vision straight away there of a dark, gothic fairy tale, a world that can only really exist in the comic books, and it's a character in and of its own. It's beautifully designed by Anton Furst in the first film, and it was described as hell exploding onto the streets. So immediately you get a sense of the sort of city that Batman operates in and what's going on. But what I really like about that first scene is it gives us the bait and switch for the audience. Now you've got to remember, back in 89, there weren't too many people that knew Batman as a character very well. I think over the years, superheroes have become hugely more popular and very much in the public eye. But at that time, the only people that knew his origins well enough were the comic book fans. And so we went into the theatre, and just for information, I was 12 at the time when I saw it. We went into the theatre thinking, wow, this is going to be amazing. We're going to see the origin of Bruce Wayne becoming Batman, see his parents gunned down, and the mission that he then goes on. But no, Burton switched it up for us, gave us a mugging in an alleyway of a different family, and used that to introduce us to Batman. And it's clear that he's just starting out in his career, but that introduction is amazing. The way that the shadows work, the way Batman first appears, the fear that he instills into the crooks, I mean, that encapsulates Batman for me. I think Nolan did a pretty good job the first time he saw Batman, but especially, the crates in the docks. But the thing for me with him is that when you see Nolan's films, they're more of a progression in origin story. And the realistic film setting of, clearly I think Dark Knight was filmed in Chicago, doesn't really give any atmosphere to the film in the way that Burton does. I think Burton's film have a whole, both of them have a really great sense of mystery about them. I mean, in 89, the audience doesn't even find out that Bruce Wayne is Batman until later on in the film. And as I said, with Nolan's films, it's a very linear story progression. I mean, you see Bruce as a kid, and then you see him grow up and lose his parents and go on his mission. And Nolan's films have the old trope, why do we fall? I think we fall because we're clumsy. So, having those lines in there did feel a little bit forced to me. And that brings me on to one of the points. It's not one of the key points as to why I prefer Burton over Nolan, but it is one of the things I have found out when I watched Christopher Nolan's films. They are extremely exposition heavy. And once you notice it, you can't unnotice it. to me, even though cinema is a shared experience, everyone should be able to interpret the film in different ways. And Nolan tries to eliminate that in all of his films by establishing a very clear narrative so that everyone has the same experience. You could call it smart filmmaking, but I think it's a little bit sad. I mean, if you want to quote another favorite film of mine based on the t-shirt that I'm wearing, some people can read War and Peace and come away thinking it's just a simple dime store novel, and others can read the ingredients of a chewing gum wrapper and unlock the secrets of the universe. So that's really what film is all about to me. Everyone can go into the same film and have completely different experiences, but Nolan does try and get around that. Anyway, so I just want to get more onto the points as to what I think Burton understood and got right about the character that I think Nolan missed the mark on. So the first point, and for me, one of the most important points, Batman doesn't give up, ever. I mean, you watch him in the movies, you see him in the comics, you look at him in the animated series, he does not give up. He is on a singular mission to stop crime. So, at the end of The Dark Knight, he quits. I mean, I think, to me, that really just gets to the fact that they didn't understand the character as well, or at least they tried to make it into a real-world setting. And that doesn't really work for me. I mean, having a throwaway line that the crime is, an all-time low is a bit of an understatement. I don't think that would really stop Bruce from going out and doing what he wants to do. It's a bit of a weak excuse. And then in the Burton films, when Vicky asks him, why he does this, he says, because no one else can. And just that line itself tells me that they got the character, they understood why he was on his mission and that he would never give up. No one else can do what he does. The second point I want to mention is that Batman has a singular force of will. This, to me at least, is his most defining characteristic and his greatest power. I mean, in the comics, he's portrayed as super intelligent, but his willpower is what sets him apart from other people. Everyone has this dream that if they trained hard enough, they could be Batman, but the will that Bruce has, at least from the character perspective, is something that I think needs to be reflected on screen. And I think the Nolan films missed the boat on that one. In the Burton ones, we don't get too much information as to how Bruce went on his path, but he molded himself into Batman. It's a shame we don't really get to see all of the origin story, and I know I've seen interviews and read articles where Michael Keaton does talk about the fact in the later films, if the first few were successful, which they were, and they stayed, they did want to do an origin story for Batman. But it's a shame we never got to see it. In Nolan's films, he does have the origin story, but the biggest thing for me is that he's trained by Ra's. He's found by Ra's and trained by Ra's. And so if Ra's never found him, there wouldn't be a Batman. So while Bruce is sort of aimlessly wandering the world and in prison in China and looking for practice, he isn't really pushing himself to become a creature of the night, or sort of understanding how his path is meant to be shaped until he meets Ra's and until Ra's trains him to be his successor. So the second point to me that I think is that point is very important. If Ra's doesn't find Bruce, there will be no Batman. And the same cannot be said for Burton's films, because Keaton is clearly somebody that wants to be Batman, or needs to be Batman, as he puts it in the film. And also as a postscript, I think the whole Ra's and Ducard fake out was really, a bit pointless to me. It didn't do much other than try and add a little bit of mystery, and the fans of the comic book were wondering what was going on. So the third point is that Bruce has too much help for me in the Nolan movies. Now, in the Burton ones, he seems fairly self-sufficient. Alfred is there with him. You can see that he's working on the Batmobile and he has his gadgets. And even the Joker asks, where does he get those wonderful toys? We don't really get to see it. But in the Nolan films, everything Bruce needs, he just wanders over to Lucius and says to Lucius, can you get me a Batmobile? And Lucius will say, why, of course, Mr. Wayne. I can find one in black. So that's a little bit of a cop-out. All the technology Batman needs is right under, his fingertips, which I think is a little bit weak. Bruce should be the one going to find, research, develop, put his technology together, which again demonstrates his force of will. Fourth point, this is more of a debatable one. I don't really think in the Nolan films he's that much of a detective. In the Burton films, we do see him do a fair amount of detective work. He has to figure out what the mix of the Joker products are to poisoning people. He has Jack Napier's file. He's doing research on the Penguin in the second one. But in the Nolan ones, yeah, he does a little bit of it. I remember the scene in The Dark Knight where he's looking for the fingerprint from the bullet casing that fragmented in the wall. And that was kind of cool. But really, a lot of this stuff, he has to go and ask other people. He has to ask Alfred, how did you find that person? Well, sir, we burned the forest down, I think he said. I think Michael Caine is a pretty good Alfred, but having Alfred be there to provide a lot of the answers for Bruce is, again, for me, a bit of a cop-out. It doesn't show that Bruce is the one pushing himself. And in fact, in The Dark Knight, he can't even find the Joker by himself. He has to hijack Lucius's technology and spy on the entire city to find his arch-nemesis. Now, it may be a small point, but Batman is the world's greatest detective. His whole thing is finding the Joker. Whenever the Joker's around, he uses detective work to track them down. He doesn't get frustrated by the fact he can't find him. He doesn't spy on the entire city in a CIA-style operation. He's able to use his brains and his skills to track the Joker down, and you see a little bit more of it in the Burton films, but in Nolan's films, that was quite lacking for me. Number 5, and there's only one more before a few special mentions, is he reveals his identity at the end of the first film. I mean, at the end of Batman Begins, he goes to Rachel and, gives a throwaway line about who he is and so what I do that counts. I thought that was a bit out of character. Batman doesn't tend to go around telling people he's Batman. He seems to fall in love with Rachel from a bit of a distance, and he whines to Alfred in the second film that Rachel's gonna leave for me, and then Alfred says, "I'm not going to tell you I told you so, sir." But to me, that is, again, a little bit weak on the character part. Yep, I do know, and it's obvious in 89 that Bruce was going to reveal his identity to Vicky, but he had fallen in love with Vicky at that point and was about to reveal it before he gets interrupted by the Joker and then has to make his escape. But, Clark Kent would never say to Lois Lane, "Hey, I'm Superman, do you want to date me?" But that's kind of what Bruce does to Rachel. He is so desperate for her validation that he reveals his identity to her at the end because he doesn't want her to think that he's just some fop playboy that has no substance to him. So just wanting and needing that validation as a character, again, doesn't sit well with me for the character of Bruce Wayne. He really, really doesn't care what other people think as long as he's in his mission and he needs to get his work done. So having him reveal himself to Rachel, I think, was not a great part of the character. And You know, as I said, Clark would never go to Lois and say, "Hey, I'm Superman. Now will you date me?" That to me wasn't great. The sixth point that I want to talk about is Robin. So in the Nolan films, Bruce passes the mantle on to Robin, but he doesn't train him. I mean, Burton couldn't really find a way to work Robin into his first two films. He had ideas and concepts about the character. He even had costume fittings and some initial story arcs, but he never really found a way to make it work. But Nolan does try to do it with his, cool twist ending of finding out the name that's Robin when he comes to the Batcave. But really, Batman passes the mantle on to a policeman. No training, no instruction manual, nothing. So I think that's a little bit irresponsible. I think if Robin goes out to try and fight crime as Batman, he'll probably last about a month. So in the Nolan films, he just passes the mantle on with no training whatsoever, which is not great from the character of Batman. One of the things he always did in the comics is he made sure the people he was working with were well trained, but he doesn't do that in the Nolan films. So those are the main points, I think, that I wanted to put on the video as to why I prefer Burton's Batman over Nolan's ones. Let's get to some of the other stuff. You can't really have a video without talking about the voice. I think the voice part was, so silly that the amount of parodies that came out after the films, it's quite incredible. Keaton had done the first film and decided to lower his register when he was speaking as Batman. And interestingly, no one had ever thought to do that before. But when you watch 89 and Returns, it just works. The voice is low and mysterious and a bit intimidating. I mean, when I hear Bale say things like, it's just, it's comical. There's some times that I once laughed out loud in the cinema, and it may strike fear into the hearts of criminals in Nolan's universe, but there were quite a few people laughing, I can tell you that. The car is another part that I definitely prefer Burton's vision on. I mean, the Batmobile was sleek and, has looked awesome. I do get where Nolan is coming from with his Batmobile being more like Frank Miller's Dark Knight Returns. But honestly, if you driving a Batmobile where in order to fire something, you have to go down into a smaller secret compartment below the steering wheel or wherever it is, and you can't see the road and you're not driving at that time, that's not great design, to be honest. I never really understood why that made sense or why that was cool. Isn't he going to crash it all the time? I mean, unless there's some AI autopilot that knows all the streets of Gotham. So that's pretty much it. I do want to mention about the look of Bale in the Nolan films. I think his height and physique, his whole visage was much closer to the comics than Burton's. And Bale does have all those attributes. But I will say that even though Keaton was shorter, a little bit balding, he did work out for 89, and he does try and look as if he's in shape. But Keaton is the actor that I think has enough crazy about him. And when you look at his eyes, and look at his eyes in the suit, he has just enough crazy about him to make it believable that he would put on a suit, go around at night, and beat up criminals. And speaking of the suit, I wasn't really a big fan of Nolan's suit. I think the neck was extremely thin. I think the open piece of the cowl was far too small, and Bale's face was almost bulging out of it and didn't look great. Whereas, Keaton's suit in 89 and Returns it looks incredible. I mean, I know he can't turn his head, but it does look incredible. It's sleek, it's visually appealing, it has all the right notes of making Batman an intimidating character. I'll say that the return suit just edges it for me over 89, but both of those visual, cinematic experiences were amazing, because just seeing the way Batman looked on screen, and whenever Bale was on screen in his suit with that head and the cowl and the oval shape at the top and the pointy ears, it didn't have the same effect, for me at least, as the original suits did. Last thing I will say is the score. I think Hans Zimmer did a pretty good job in trying to come up with a score for Batman and ratcheting up the tension by his sort of single note elements in the Dark Knight. But Danny Elfman's score, I've got to say, when I think of Batman, I think of those notes and that tune and that music. It really encapsulates his, mysteriousness, the comic book nature, all of these elements that I associate with it. It could be because that was the first score that resonated with me as a kid when I went to see the 89 film in the cinema. But honestly, I think the score is amazing. It's so good, in fact, that he brought it back when he replaced Junkie XL on Justice League, and did put some of those notes into the Justice League film. So if you didn't know that, watch it again. You will hear parts of Elfman's score in it, and then you play the Lego games and you see the movies, and Elfman's score is iconic. I mean, it's close, in my opinion, very close to the Superman score, but it is amazing. And so also musically, I think that Burton's vision resonated more with me than Nolan's did. So that's the end of the video, my first one for my YouTube channel that I've done myself. Hope you enjoyed it. Hope you liked all of the points that I had to make. Whether you agreed or disagreed, that's fine. Everything is personal interpretation and opinion. Clearly I'm not out to change anyone's minds, but I did want to put across some of the reasons why I think that Burton's Batman is better than Nolan's Batman. So one final point I want to make is, don't really want to get into the big debate about Batman doesn't kill. In the Burton films, there's quite a lot of on-screen evidence to point to the fact that he probably does. We don't actually see any on-screen deaths. And I know, obviously, in the late 30s, early 40s, when Bob Kane and Bill Finger introduced the character, he did kill for a bit. I think Burton was a bit ambiguous on the subject. He did say that he felt Batman does what he needs to do, but he didn't go outright and say, oh yeah, he goes around killing people. But in the Nolan films, while he does have this no-kill rule, I do think he takes some liberties with it. Towards the end of The Dark Knight Rises, I think there's a truck that he blows up with Talia al Ghul's people on it. So, yeah, you could get into that debate. Maybe I'll do that in another video. I think there are elements from Nolan's films as well that potentially could have broken that rule. But just wanted to say I hadn't forgotten about that fact. It's just not something I think is a huge point to compare, because I do think he kills in Nolan's films as well. But that's just my view on that one. So that's it. That's the end of the video. Hope you enjoyed it. Hope you found my points interesting. If you agree or disagree, please comment in the section below. And I'm going to start putting up more videos on the channel, not just on the Batman films, because I do love most of them and I want to talk about them more, but lots of other films that I like, and also I don't like, because I'm the miserable movie man after all. So please comment, like, subscribe, share with your friends, and hope you have a really great day.